I quite like to say sometimes that inner speech has been, the history of inner speech has been written by people who talk to themselves a lot.
Dr. Ben Alderson-Day, what's the most important context for the listener to understand their own inner speech?
Well, that's an interesting question. If it's a question about why is inner speech important, then you could say something about child development or the development of the mind. If it's a question about adulthood, then I would say it's most relevant to how we think about mental health and how our inner dialogues and inner monologues shape how we're experiencing the world, how we confront distress and difficulty, but also then how we repair, how we engage in things like psychological therapies. Understanding your own inner speech and being aware of it is super crucial for that kind of context.
Do you think people generally have an awareness of the contents of their inner speech, the frequency, any other features that inner speech might have? Do you think people generally have a good idea of that?
For the most part, no. And that's not to say that they can't, but I think a lot of people will go about their day not really thinking about it too much, even if they're people who talk to themselves absolutely all the time. And very often, when people start to think about it, is when they are confronted with um, reports from other people that radically differ. So every feels like every 6 months or so, something will go viral somewhere on the internet about somebody discovering that other people don't do dialogues in their head, or some people talk to themselves all the time, and it might not be about inner speech. It could be about mental images. It could be about other kind of aspects of inner experience that suddenly people realize they're not like others, and they're astounded by it. I mean, and how would they ever know? It's kind of a core problem within philosophy, that the idea that we don't know the contents of other minds, and we would be oblivious unless we just rely on what people tell us. So it can be suddenly a real awakening, I think, for some people to think about their inner speech differently when they hear about the potential contrasts.
Is my inner speech me?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to be in your voice, but it is you in that it's part of your mind. Yeah.
You've done work on people that have voices in their mind that they swear aren't them. Is that right?
Yeah, in lots of different ways. Yeah. So I've worked with people with psychosis who hear voices that other people can't hear, and um, often that will be voices that literally feel like they're coming from outside, and that you're hearing them like you would hear any other voice in a room. But even some of those voices, particularly over time, might feel like they're actually coming from inside the head, and they might have the kind of the characteristics or properties of sound. So they might have kind of tone and cadence, or even a sense of volume, and yet it could feel like they're part of your kind of inner realm, your inner world. So that's one kind of context I've worked with, those sorts of voices. But I've also worked with people who've tried to create spiritual voices, or who have tried to create characters of the mind that speak for themselves. There's various different groups who do that. So yeah, there's a real like constellation of things out there.
Do we know why some people develop inner speeches that have different accents, different voices, different emotions, and some people don't? Do we understand the development of these different types of inner speech?
Well, I guess we don't really know, firstly, why some people have lots of inner speech and some people don't. Um, for a long time in the study of inner speech, there was always this argument that everybody does this and everybody does this all the time. And I think research over the past 15 years or so, and we've contributed to this as well, has shown that actually this is an exaggeration. There's plenty of people out there who don't seem to have either kind of inner monologue or dialogue, who don't seem to rely on kind of inner language and think about the world in different ways. Um, so, for starters, not everybody does it, and there is some evidence that you get some variation, say among children, where there are challenges to their language or their communicative development. So, um, at various times in the diagnosis of autism, for example, you would have had to have had a delay in your speech and language in the first 3 years of life. So you might be talking about kids who were non-speaking at the age of 3, when we'd usually expect that between 18 months and 2 years, this sort of thing. Or, for example, deaf people, 95% have hearing parents, and that means that the development of their language skills can be very challenging because most hearing parents won't learn sign language. Deaf children will be encouraged to learn, called learning orally, where you learn to lip read and you try and practice your own voice even when you're not getting the proper auditory feedback. And so there's various well-documented delays in language communication in deafness. And there's some evidence, there's not great evidence, that actually things like kind of inner speech are slightly different in those sorts of cases. If early language is different, then later kind of self-talk is also going to be slightly different as well. But the evidence is very patchy, and actually in the kind of history of doing work with these sorts of populations isn't so good. So ultimately, we don't know why. There's big variations. We've got good theories why, relating to things like language development, but we don't have great evidence. In terms of like the richness of what people experience, now this likely reflects their own experiences, the kind of worlds around them. There's studies of people who have inner speech in different languages based on where they lived when they were growing up or when they moved to a different country. There's research looking at kind of inner speech being related to things like having imaginary friends and imaginary companions and kind of different developmental phases as well. So inner speech is a kind of almost like a rich sponge through development that will start to reflect your outer world, because ultimately that's what language does. That's what your external language does. It's what your speech does. It reflects who you are and where you're from, the words that you choose. It's a picture of who you are, and inner speech is no different.
I think this would be very hard to experimentally determine, but do we know when it emerges in development? I think language, of course, will come first, but do we know at what point in language development does the first semblance of inner speech start emerging? Again, I can't really even figure out what experiment you would do to run this, because most people, again, as you say, don't have an awareness of their own don't have knowledge of the contents or frequency of their own inner speech. So how you're going to ask a 3-year-old in an experimental paradigm about their inner speech, I don't know. But do we know anything around questions in those areas?
Yeah, so there are ways that you can approach this, and there's several different lines of research within developmental psychology that have tried to explore it. So to go back to some theory, first of all, there's a Soviet psychologist called Lev Vygotsky, who was working in the 30s. He's been incredibly influential in this area. And he had a theory that essentially inner speech is internalized external speech. And what happens is that while a child is growing up, they first learn to talk in conversation with adults around them. And what they do is they learn to narrate what they're doing. They'll have a dialogue about the game that they're playing, the puzzle they're trying to solve, the bridge they're trying to build. And there'll be kind of back and forth, question and answer. And what you can fairly consistently see is kids aged, say, kind of 3 to 5, they'll then do that themselves, right? So they'll talk to themselves while they're doing something. And very often there's almost this kind of sing-song element where they'll ask themselves questions and answer it as if they're having that dialogue still with the caregiver, even though it's just them on their own. That's a phenomenon known as private speech. And it's been studied for decades within developmental psychology. What you see post age 5, getting towards kind of age 7 or 8, is you sometimes still see children talk to themselves, particularly when they're trying to solve problems, but gradually they get quieter and quieter. So a classic example is things like arithmetic, learning to do arithmetic, where you're trying to learn it out loud, and then you're doing sums on paper, and you still get some children who might talk their way through a problem, but gradually kind of get quieter and kind of quieter in how they do it, almost to the point where they're like whispering to themselves. And some people have argued that this is kind of essentially private speech going under the hood and becoming inner speech, becoming this kind of inner dialogue where you don't need to talk out loud. In a similar way to when we learn to read, we learn to read out loud. And then gradually we learn the ability to actually just read in our heads and not have to say it out loud as well. But that comes after once we've done the external bit. Now, part of your question was how the hell do you go measure that stuff? And there's a classic finding from studies of verbal memory, which shows that if you give children, say, a set of words or pictures and you go past the amount they can usually remember, the children who essentially don't have inner speech will really struggle to remember all the words that they need to remember. But children who do have inner speech can actually start to rehearse the words they need to remember and start to say it to themselves in their own heads using something called the phonological loop. So that what they could do is use the inner speech as a kind of memory aid. And then when it comes to doing the tasks, they can actually solve them. And usually we see children from the age of about 7 being able to do that. If they're doing that as well, they also start to show evidence that they're turning things into linguistic codes. So if you do this test with like pictures, and then you say, right, in a few minutes, you're going to tell me what pictures you saw. If they were just remembering the pictures and then had to point them out, then what we wouldn't expect is like certain types of linguistic information to interfere with that. But if they were coding them into words and the words sounded similar, then some of the similar words are also going to interfere with their recall, something called the phonological similarity effect. So children who do this verbal rehearsal are also more susceptible to these sorts of effects, which are actually to do with phonology, to do with speech. But they have to be doing that in their heads for that to even occur. So those sorts of effects are usually taken as good evidence that actually what children start to do around about age 7 is they start to recode things into internal language to support things like memory. And we can trace that and we can show that this sort of thing is happening. So yeah, about age 7 is often what people would say for the beginnings of inner speech in that way.
Super interesting. Well explained. The reason I'm so interested in this is because I did this 10-week inner experience sampling experiment with Dr. Russell Hurlburt. Are you familiar
Russ?
with?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I've
with
worked
Russ.
with
Yeah.
Russ before. Yeah.
Incredible. Yeah. Russ is amazing. I love Russ. We've had many conversations and I find his work so interesting. But so I went through that 10-week process and I had ideas about my inner speech on day 1. And it turns out that practically all of them were wrong. By the end of the 10 weeks, at least in what 10 weeks of sampling revealed, you're going to get a decent guess. It's not going to be perfect. So with me at the age of like 28, not really understanding the contents of my inner speech, I was there and thinking, like, how the hell are you going to get at a toddler's inner speech? So like you have all these kind of correlational proxies, right? Sort of indications, but these things could happen without that internalization of inner speech, right? There still is, when it comes to phenomenology, there's a bit of guesswork there because you can't really ask them and get a reliable response. That's right?
Yeah, you wouldn't be doing that with children. They would find it very hard, I think.
Yeah. Do we have accurate numbers, or what does the best data say, do you think, on how many people don't have any inner speech at all?
So there has been some work on something called anendophasia, which is a term coined by Johanna Nedergaard and Gary Lupjan, a language researcher. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you what proportion they're getting for kind of full-on anendophasia. I think if it's something like aphantasia, which is the inability to experience any sort of mental images, then it could be as high as people like kind of 10 to 20% of the population wouldn't be doing this sort of thing. I guess there's a question about like whether people tend to be doing it versus whether they can do it. And something like aphantasia, you really get people who just can't do it. Whereas a lot of the time with inner speech, it might be that people think that they're doing this a lot, but they're actually not doing it that much. Like, so they can do it, they can bring it to mind, but it's not a spontaneous part of their experience in a kind of really dominant way that people might otherwise expect. And often people do think it's crucial there, right? Because a lot of our folk models of thinking involve language. If you think about a program like Peep Show, now a slightly dated reference, to get
Love
into
Peep Show.
somebody's
Great reference. Great reference.
get into the inner world, that what you've got is constant monologue, right? You've got constant talk, and that's supposed to be, that's what they're thinking at any one point. It would be very hard to that, wouldn't it? That show, if we were actually thought in kind of other modalities, whether it's visual or whatever like that, that would be really hard to show anyway. But what that picks up on is this kind of folk idea of what it is to have a conscious experience, or to be thinking, be aware that you're thinking, is to have a linguistic experience.
Yes.
So that governs a lot of kind of, I think, how people think about it, and also what people report. At the same time, so I've worked with Russ a fair bit, and I've never taken part in descriptive experience sampling, but I have been part of the interviewing group. And
Right.
so sometimes I've led interviews and Russ has been to the side, or vice versa, or this was a few years back now. And I guess one thing that struck me is that if we DES is sometimes a bit like a microscope, right? And if we crank up the microscope, we go zoom in right to that moment of experience and pick out what's happening right before the moment of the beat. We might indeed pick out a moment of sensory experience in real kind of depth and wonder, a pure sense of Evan is looking at the color purple, or Evan is thinking about his sore back, or something like that, or Evan is thinking about the cinema, and that's it. It was rare in my experience that we'd pick out, kind of quite deep conceptual thoughts or arguments, or even parts of dialogues, when we did DES. But I'd be very concerned about suggesting that those things aren't part of people's thinking and experience. I think they are. They just might be, at a broader scale. They might be moments that happen once in a week as opposed to all the time. Something about the cranking of the microscope means we're also missing some perhaps quite important features of people's experience. That kind of
Yes.
next level of strata, and that might be conceptual experience. It might be linguistic experience. So when we ask people, how do you think, or how do you experience the world? It's not necessarily that they're wrong if they say, well, a lot of the time I talk to myself and all these sorts of things. But what they're saying is, well, an important part of my experience to tell you about is a lot of the time I talk to myself, if that's how I experience it. And I also do all the other things, like I notice when my foot is itchy, but that's not an important part of my experience. It's not, the very sensory and the kind of very everyday, they're part of it too. But depending on what tool we use, we pick out these things at differing levels of focus. Okay. And Russ certainly built a lovely microscope, but it's not the only tool.
For sure. And there's definitely issues with it. I felt that when I was starting my experience sampling for the day, you have to carry around this kind of box that looks a bit strange, and it looks like,
Yeah.
it's from the 1970s or something, and you're kind of wiring in this earphone that he gave you, and it's clearly a different experience than usual, and you're kind of waiting for the beep, and then you're thinking, well, why hasn't it beeped in a while? It hasn't beeped. So there's it's not quite pristine. But
Yeah.
I did get some interesting realizations. 10 weeks, I think you get a breakdown of, like, if you do very, very little inner speech, you'll probably figure that out. If you do a lot,
Yeah.
you'll probably figure that out. If you're in the middle, there's probably some error bars on like less or more, but like you'll figure out where you are if there's any extremes. Or like I realized that a lot of my experience is bodily. Like a lot of my
Mm.
emotions I feel in the body. And in general, something like 50% of my samples had some level of bodily sensory experience. And that would have been something that I would have identified with a bit, but it really drove it home. And I was like, wow, okay, that is true. That really is, like if I'm sick, I always feel like a level of disembodiment, like a disconnection from my body. If I'm feeling really, really good about life, I feel richly embodied. So
Mm-hmm.
something I learned in that experience is that I really do experience things in the body. So you can figure stuff out. And I wasn't doing as many dramatic inner dialogue battles with smart people that I certainly thought I was. I always thought I was having these richly intellectual debates with people, going back and forth on these interesting, I didn't really do that in my samples, but it gets, as you say, it's a microscope on, I think, what is the most difficult question there is, which is phenomenology.
Absolutely. And I should say as well, that Russ will say himself, about 25% of people he talks to do use a lot of inner speech. There's just what he's always emphasized. There's just a whole big variety of other things that can be going on, and yeah, the striking thing I remember doing those interviews with him was how many people we talked to who ended up being surprised about their own experience, like it would go off in different directions that they weren't anticipating. So there's something really valuable about that process and that insight, I think. And in general, like the whether it's psychology, cognitive science, philosophy of mind, often they are very, very speech and language focused. I quite like to say sometimes that inner speech has been the history of inner speech has been written by people who talk to themselves a lot. You know, that you get this particularly through the influence of philosophy. Actually, people who do a lot of thinking in their mind with words are also the people who are then driven to write about it, and who will posit a very strong alliance between certain types of conscious experience or higher order thinking and a very verbalized kind of experience. And that excludes lots of other people in terms of the actual experiences that they're having, including, say, marginalized groups or groups who have kind of atypical development of any kind, or for whom speech just isn't an important part of their experience, right? They, they can think, they can have rich inner lives, but it doesn't mean that they are doing it in the same way. And it's a problem to kind of ally certain things about how the mind works too closely to the fact that some people just talk to themselves a lot.
Yes.
It could just be a kind of accidental thing. It could be that some people just happen to do that and some people don't. It could be a quirk. It could be a kind of evolutionary byproduct of other systems, and it might not mean anything. It might not actually translate into something which then impacts upon actually how thinking works, or what kind of things you can think. But I think that's not to say it's not still part of kind of a rich part of people's lives and a very interesting phenomenon to explore. But it's just important to recognize the diversity, like people like yourself, where
Yes.
actually inner experience could take on a very different shape.
I hope you enjoyed this clip from the Giant Shoulder podcast. If you did, you should check out these ones next. Remember to subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for the support.